Hello, everyone. This is day 3 or lecture 3 of hidden Markov models in marine sciences. I'm going to cover model selection for hidden Markov models today, including covariates, counting for heterogeneity using random effects, additional hierarchical structures, and incorporating state labels. So first up, model selection. How do we select an HMM? And it really comes down to, well, are we in search of the right HMM that explains our data well? So we've covered how to fit a hidden Markov model and what a hidden Markov model is. We can now construct various candidate models that vary in terms of the number of states. So for example, should we choose a 2-state HMM? Should we choose a 3-state HMM? And so on. And really, there's no limit. Should we choose a 7-state hidden Markov model for our data? We can also vary the forms of the state-dependent distributions. So what about a normal distribution versus a gamma distribution? So picking the best model amongst the candidate models is called model selection. And I want to sort of emphasize this piece, that we are constructing candidate models and then selecting amongst them, right? There's going to be no guarantees that the true model is actually among these models that we've constructed, but all we want to do here is choose one of the models that we've constructed. Of course, aside from just comparing models to each other, we can also do model checking via pseudo-residuals. So one of the common ways to choose amongst models in the statistical literature is to use information criterion. So there's 2 general information criteria that are used to compare models for hidden Markov models in momentum. There's the AIC, the Kaike information criterion, which tends to pick the best model in terms of its predictive capacity. There's also the BIC, the Bayesian information criterion, which tends to pick the best model in terms of its goodness of fit. Now, we generally don't think about these 2 information criterion in terms of predictive capacity and goodness of fit, but that's truly what they try to do. Of course, the models we choose amongst depends on those we construct. So in the choice of selecting the number of states in a hidden Markov model, this is probably one of the first things that people try to decide. How many states should I have in my hidden Markov model? So doing this in practice is often of interest. However, these information criterion, they tend to favor models with too many states. And we'll get into what too many states might actually mean in practice. But reasons for this might be simply because assumptions such as the Markov property, the conditional independence assumption, or observations given the states, maybe also the forms of the state-dependent distributions are approximately valid. It's not going to be the perfect model for our data depending on its complexity. A hidden Markov model is often useful, but it may not be completely realistic. Right? It lacks detailed mechanisms of the animal system. In part because our hidden Markov models, we have the evolution of the states is described by a first order Markov chain. Given the states, we observe some type of movement that reflects that behavior at time t, right? But we don't actually incorporate dynamics of the animal system. And so our hidden Markov model may be approximately valid for that system, but may lack some realism. What happens then is that additional states are able to pick up these patterns, but they don't provide too much actual information into our system that we're trying to model. So some practical guidance to selecting the number of states. AIC and BIC, and I think in general information criterion in ecology, it can be used as a guidance. It doesn't have to be implemented as a rule, as this is the choice by AIC, BIC, and this is then the truth. So one thing can be that we start with m equal 2, right? So n equals 2 states, And we can build slowly. So we start with m equals 2. We compare to m equals 3. We can compare to m equals 4. And we identify what each additional state contributes to the model. And also what observations are assigned to each state as well. So maybe it could be, for instance, that a 3-state model is nearly good enough, while the 4-state model just picks up some small patterns that we weren't able to pick up with the 3-state model. But actually, we might lose interpretability if we make the model more complex. So it is a bit of a balance. So we want to balance the model fit, the complexity of the model, and the key part of it about implementing hidden Markov models for animal movement data is that we want them to be interpretable. So we want to actually be able to interpret these states as meaningful proxies of animal behavior. If we construct, for example, a 10-state hidden Markov model, we need to be able to connect each of those 10 states to something meaningful. Otherwise, we're just constructing these very flexible models that capture different patterns, but are not going to provide that level of interpretability that we might be looking for. So generally, when we build hidden Markov models for animal movement, there are reasons for keeping things on the simpler side of not implementing hidden Markov models with too many states. And in tutorials, we can talk about what this actually means in practice. But of course, there also may be, if we do end up with favoring a hidden Markov model that has way too many states and we have different individuals, it can also be due to simply unexplained individual variability across the states that can be accounted for with factors like size and age of the individuals. For example, different individuals of different sizes might simply move differently. But in general, we want to balance model fit when choosing the number of states, the complexity of the model, and how that connects to interpretability. So overall, model selection in hidden Markov models, we are always going to look to information criterion at its best as a guidance. It's not going to be treated as a rule. It's simply going to guide us into relatively better models and relatively worse models for our data. We choose the best model amongst those we construct, and we should really be careful to keep this in mind. It's going to be unclear whether the true model is amongst these that could have generated our data. And now, also in terms of the state decodings, what if our state decodings don't change across different HMMs with the same number of states? And we can maybe reflect about this a bit more in the tutorials, but it could be that incorporating covariates or extending the models, making them more complex, but keeping the states the same, doesn't actually change the state decodings or the state assignments. And as I mentioned previously, if we don't have anything to validate the states with, so if we don't have behavioral labels, we can't use the states in any way to meaningfully do model checking for hidden Markov models. So when we build more complex models, we may actually have the same state decodings across models, but it's simply because this can be quite robust to model misspecification. So with model selection in the hidden Markov models, we can use information criterion as a guidance, we balance complexity, interpretability, and so on. So once we've selected the number of states, which is often the first thing to do, so select the number of states, or generally, a subset of end state hidden Markov models to work with. So for example, if we move forward, we could say, well, we want to maybe test 2-state and 3-state hidden Markov models. Right? But step one is generally trying to gauge an idea of how many states we want to work with in our hidden Markov model. And then stage two is the extensions. So incorporating covariates. And when we think about incorporating covariates, what we're trying to do is incorporate drivers of movement. So one of the key reasons hidden Markov models are so popular is that they not only cluster observations into different states that hopefully serve as proxies for behavior, but we can also directly incorporate covariates that may drive the observed behaviors. For example, animals at different times of day, in different environmental conditions, and so on, may exhibit differing types of movement strategies. We do this in HMMs by incorporating covariates in the transition probability matrix. However, we can also incorporate covariates in the state-dependent distributions. So covariates in the state process, including covariates in the transition probability matrix, i.e. the mechanism that describes the evolution of the states over time, allows us to answer the following question or questions. Do animals vary their behavior under different environmental conditions, time of day, or other conditions observed? The transition probability matrix tells us how animals switch between states, but also how long they remain in a state. Including covariates such as time of day provides a nice summary of what behaviors are likely to be exhibited at different times of day. So how does this actually work in practice? So if we want to include covariates in the state process, that means that our transition matrix now depends on the values of the covariates at each time point. So recall that this is a matrix, gamma, with entries that are bounded between 0 and 1. And further, that the sum of the rows is equal to 1. So for a 2-state hidden Markov model, using the constraints given above, we can write our transition matrix as follows. We know that gamma, now incorporating this notation T, so this is going to vary depending on the conditions at each time point, is equal to 1 minus gamma sub 1, 2, gamma sub 1, 2, and so on. So right, we're here, we equate to is equal to 1 minus this. And we can do this because we know is equal to 1. So we could rewrite our transition matrix for a 2-state hidden Markov model in this manner. Then, in order to incorporate covariates, we need to transform gamma sub 1, 2 and gamma sub 2, 1 so that they span the entire real line, just like when we talked about fitting the HMM in practice, going from the natural parameters to the working parameters. So like the constrained to unconstrained transformation. In a 2-state hidden Markov model, what is simply done is we take the logit, which maps parameters that are bounded between 0 and 1 onto the real line. And then we're back to a linear regression. So we have some intercept, some baseline patterns of how these animals switch between the different behaviors. And then we have our covariates and the effects of our covariates with this beta sub k's. So this piece here allows us to vary by observed conditions, or time of day, except TK. And really, this is a vector. So in this way, we're back to a sort of linear regression framework, which is really just like a generalized linear model, or we can think about it like a logistic regression. So we're doing a logistic regression in a two-state hidden Markov model to understand how the state process, the state switching dynamics vary across time. We can also extend this to m over m greater than 2 states, which is what momentum does for us. And as before, our goal is to estimate the values of betas. And from that, we derive estimates of the actual probabilities over time. Now, what's key is that we can also assess whether the values of beta deviate from 0. So when we do a linear regression or a generalized linear model, we want to understand, are these covariates important factors in the observation process? So does it actually affect the movement process or not? Is there actually variation across time of day? Do these animals vary their behavior in different habitats? So we can think about loosely which beta values are significant and not significant. And this provides some insight into the ecological process that we're interested in. Now, beyond just incorporating these covariates and looking at how these values of gamma change over time, right, where we have the interpretation for gamma sub 1, 2 is the probability of switching to state 2 at time t plus 1, given that we are in state 1 at time t. And we can incorporate covariates and our probabilities vary over time. However, we can also look at the so-called marginal stationary distribution of the transition probability matrix at time t, given covariates x of t, which is this vector. Those entries, delta sub I of x of t, is going to give us the probabilities of CT equal to I, where I goes from 1 to m. So under the observed conditions x of t, we obtain the probabilities that the animals will exhibit one of the m states in those conditions. So perhaps one of the betas are significant. We have that there's important factors, environmental conditions, that do affect the movement patterns of the animals of interest. And then the question is, well, how do we interpret this? Once we derive these probabilities, it actually provides a useful way to interpret what this actually means in practice. So for example, in one of my recent papers, we used overall dynamic body acceleration derived from accelerometers placed on 4 oceanic white-tip sharks in the Bahamas. We constructed a 3-state hidden Markov model to identify 3 different activity levels for these sharks. And then the key question was, well, do the activity patterns of these sharks vary across time of day? We have, for example, when m equals 3, we had one state that seemed to reflect the most active periods of these sharks. So state 3, for example, here. And what this plot is then giving us, these are these marginal stationary probabilities. What we realized is that the 4 different sharks, for the short periods that they were tagged, exhibited 4 different types of activity patterns in terms of when they were most active. So we have 4 sharks, yellow, blue, orange, purple. The purple shark tended to be more active across, say, 4 p.m., but also had a period of activity around 3 a.m. Other sharks, like the orange shark, tended to be more active in the middle of the day, and so on. So here, this plot is giving us CT equal to state 3 across time of day. And so these are the types of results that we can get once we incorporate covariates into the transition probability matrix. And it's quite useful because we can then understand when are animals least active? When are they exhibiting certain behaviors? What is the probability that they'll be in a very active state under these conditions? So those are things we can get from fitting a hidden Markov model. And now we can also incorporate covariates in state-dependent distributions. And one of the reasons to do so can be to allow for individual or seasonal specific state-dependent distributions. For example, if we care about measures like step length, like horizontal distance traveled, we might need to account for variation in step lengths across individuals of different sizes, or that some behaviors like traveling may manifest differently in the summer versus the winter. So this has been done in a few papers. With the caveat that once we allow for individual specific, like different values of the state-dependent distributions for each individual, we want to make sure that we can still compare. Is state one the same across all individuals? Can we interpret it in the same manner? Which is why oftentimes when we incorporate covariates in HMMs, we incorporate it in the transition probability matrix. And that way we keep the state-dependent distributions fixed and we can interpret it the same way. So how we incorporate covariates in the state-dependent distributions often depends on the distributional forms. But what we can often do is vary the means of the distributions by individual. For example, you can have for state I, that particular mean is equal to tau sub 0 plus tau sub 1 times the size of the individual. So maybe we expect that larger individuals will be able to travel longer distances in 5 minutes than if a smaller individual was also traveling, they might simply not cover as much distance. So fundamentally, it's the same behavior, but the distributions of the movement patterns that correspond to that behavior vary across individuals. So incorporating these covariates in the state-dependent distributions accounts for that factor. So if we've measured important covariates, accounted for differences across sizes, seasons, habitat, and so on, and we still have leftover heterogeneity, we can also include random effects in hidden Markov models. So accounting for variability across individuals. Suppose there's variability across individuals not accounted for by covariates at hand. We can incorporate random effects. And it's not completely different than how we're used to incorporating random effects in linear models. So pooling wise, complete pooling in hidden Markov models. This means keeping the states and transition probability matrices the same across all individuals. So one of the reasons to keep the states and the transition matrices the same across all individuals is that it keeps things simple to interpret. Now, no pooling, we have different state-dependent distributions and different transition matrices across individuals. So for example, suppose you have 10 individuals that you're interested in studying. If you want to fit a hidden Markov model to them, generally, the first suggestion is to do complete pooling. So can you fit the same hidden Markov model to all of them, which means that they would share the states that you construct are the same across all individuals. And then you have the same transition matrix across all individuals as well. Of course, it might also be of interest to do no pooling. So if you fit the same M state hidden Markov model to each individual, you get vastly different results. And if we can keep it under complete pooling, that might provide the most rigidity, but it also makes it quite easy to interpret the model. If we find that there's simply too much variation and that we lose explaining that variation by complete pooling, we can typically then turn to partial pooling. So we try this and we try that. The best and the easiest would be this, the complete pooling. This is the preferred. And the second preferred. Generally, we do not want to do no pooling in terms of actually finding the results. No pooling is fine as an exploratory approach. But generally, we might lose the interpretability of state one, for example, being consistent or being able to be interpreted consistently across those individuals. So partial pooling, it allows for variation across individuals in the state dependent distribution and or the transition matrix. So partial pooling then allows us to provide some more flexibility to the model to account for variability across individuals, but the variation doesn't have to occur everywhere. So the first approach can be to incorporate continuous valued random effects in terms of partial pooling. So often this is done by assuming that some of the parameters differ by individual, but although they differ, they come from the same distributional form. So for example, you can have that the means are individual, each case individual has different means, but that they come from a normal distribution with some population mean and some population standard deviation. We can also do this similarly in the transition matrix so that each individual has their own specific baseline state switching dynamics. And so often what we care to vary is really the baseline, simply the beta zeros. we generally don't vary the beta ones or anything else that's associated with a covariate. We generally just want to adjust baseline state switching dynamics across individuals. However, in a maximum likelihood framework, this can be computationally challenging to implement. And in Momentum, they do implement continuous value random effects, but I believe they do so via a two-stage approach. So it's possible. However, there's also these so-called discrete valued random effects, which are typically assumed for the state switching dynamics, i.e. the transition probability matrix. It assumes that there are now G possible transition matrices that account for all of the differences exhibited across individuals. So what it can do is it can help cluster individuals who have similar state switching dynamics, but allows for differences for others. It's computationally easier to implement, so we are now accounting for variability across individuals by constructing these groups. But we introduce the challenge of estimating, well, how many groups do we need now to account for all the variability? So it's computationally easier, it's more feasible, but there's a caveat that we now need to choose G as well. So we have different manners to incorporate random effects to account for heterogeneity. We can do so in the state-dependent distributions, in the transition matrices, we could do that in both. But really, random effects in hidden Markov models are going to be useful when we do not have the information available through a covariate. So I'll talk now a little bit about the so-called hierarchical hidden Markov models. I like to call them multi-scale hidden Markov models. And I'll do a bit of a broad overview of what they are and why they might be useful. In a general hidden Markov model structure, we have just this piece here. So this is the basic graphical structure of a hidden Markov model, where we have the state process and we have the observation process. In these hierarchical hidden Markov models, what we do now is we extend it so that there's multiple state processes evolving at different temporal resolutions. So we introduce the idea of a production and an internal state when we only have two state processes evolving at different temporal scales. So why would we be interested in making hidden Markov models even more complex? I tend to work on a lot of shark data. And what I noticed often is that people are quite interested in this time of day, activity by time of day. But as I thought more about the sharks, I wondered, do they need to be consistently following the same pattern every day? And when I look at the data, I notice that they generally don't. They may not just have one type of daily pattern. So these are deaths of a single tiger shark in Hawaii across various days. It was difficult to visualize exactly what was happening here in terms of the movement. So what I did is I subtracted, I did 2 times the absolute change in depth. So how much they were moving across the water column. And then this, processing the data in this way, allowed me to note the big differences that I generally expected to see. So on March 15th, what we see the shark doing is a lot of movement across the vertical water column. So it's not remaining in a single depth. It's changing quite a bit. But on March 19th, what I noticed is that there were multiple days where the shark didn't tend to move very much, at least in the vertical water column. There were multiple days where there seemed to be a period of less activity during the middle of the day. And so if people are generally interested in time of day patterns, and if I didn't account for possible differences across days, what would happen is that I would average over days like March 15th and days like March 19th. I would put them all together. But I thought there should be a way to then account for these different daily patterns, which is actually one of the reasons why I started working with hierarchical hidden Markov models. And so some basic results. What I ended up doing is I constructed a hierarchical hidden Markov model with 2 internal states and 3 production states. What does that mean? That I think there's at least two types of daily activity patterns in sharks. And this is just based on the 20 days that I had available to me. So we have 2 internal states, 3 production states. And as you can see, these are our estimates. And then what I was able to do is I was able to go through each of the 2021 days and assign each day to one of the 2 different types of daily activity patterns, along with plotting some of the uncertainty associated with it. So there were some days that are clearly internal state 2, other days that are more associated with one of the other patterns. And I could also look at how activity changed across time of day for some of the sharks in the different internal states. And whenever I build these more complex hidden Markov models, mathematically I can sort of see, okay, I have different estimates. This sort of makes sense, but I find it very hard to understand mathematical models without simulating from them. Because I realize that simulating data then gives me a better intuition for the types of patterns that are actually being captured by the models. So here is one simulation from the fitted model. And we have, again, 2 daily patterns. We have the blue and we have the beige. So when I simulate from this fitted hierarchical hidden Markov model, I notice that the beige corresponds to days where there's very little activity in the middle of the day. And I can see this. Whereas on the blue days, there's much more activity. I also note that even in my small simulation, there tended to be more beige days in a row before switching. So there's like a blue here, day 5. There wouldn't be another blue day until day 9. Then there were 3 blue days in a row. And so the idea is that we can construct different daily patterns for these sharks. We could also incorporate other covariates. And part of the reason why I wanted to do this as well is I wanted to think about energy. So if the sharks are doing more yo-yo dives, or they're in a place where have to move quite a bit more across the vertical water column, is it likely they're maybe expending more energy? Are they foraging? And likely there'll be then a period of rest that might be needed. So we can start to try to answer those questions by moving toward hierarchical hidden Markov models. One of the other reasons we wanted to do this is from one of the papers that I published with my co-authors, joint modeling of multi-scale animal movement data using these hierarchical HMMs. And the idea then is that if we have multiple sensors on one individual that records data at different temporal scales. For example, if depth is often recorded less frequently than acceleration. So we noticed that we often had time series with different temporal resolutions. So what we thought is, well, we can extend the graphical structure again. So suppose we have one time series where we have data at a coarser temporal scale, then we have another time series here. So we can combine the data, we can identify behavioral patterns at multiple temporal scales and still model everything jointly. So if we collect observations at a finer temporal scale, we also can identify hopefully behaviors at that fine scale as well as connect a sequence of the fine scale behaviors with a larger scale behavioral state. So part of my motivation here, and I think this was maybe a good start, it can be improved a bit. We had a collaboration with Chris Lowe at the Shark Lab, that is at California State University, Long Beach. And we have data on horn sharks. So the horn sharks were tracked, and there was a position recorded every 2 seconds when possible. These horn sharks also had an accelerometer tag on them. So we had the data, I believe it was at 25 Hertz for the accelerometer, and then the position, if possible, every 2 seconds. So we had a mismatch there already. And of course, one thing we could have possibly done is simply average the accelerometer data in some way. So we had one summary statistic every 2 seconds to go with the active tracking position. What we decided to do, however, is simply employ this hierarchical hidden Markov model structure, because we knew if there was a change in position that really implied traveling behavior, or that they were moving. Simply put, they were moving, maybe not traveling, but just moving around. What we really wanted to focus on was, what were the sharks doing when there was no change in position? Up to, of course, some measurement error. When there's no change in position, the horn sharks can be hanging out and just resting. However, if there's no change in position, they could also be eating something. They might be eating an urchin. And so we were able to pick up this different pattern at a fine temporal scale versus the other pattern that's pretty flat. And so we combined the fine scale accelerometer data with the coarser scale positional data and saw that there might be no change in position, but in some cases, the horn shark is actively doing something still, either foraging or doing something else. or it also might be resting. So the hierarchical hidden Markov model can be extended then to model time series at different temporal scales in the same analysis. So we've covered quite a bit, covered model selection, covariates, random effects, hierarchical hidden Markov models. And even in the previous lecture, I mentioned that, well, we can do state decoding, but if we don't have anything to validate it with, like behavioral labels, we don't use it. And so far, I haven't mentioned that at all. But generally, there's 3 HMMs, only one of which is often used in the study of animal movement. So there's 3 manners of applying a hidden Markov model to movement data. And typically, what we do is a so-called unsupervised learning framework, which means we don't incorporate any labeled data, any behaviors into the time series. There are broadly 2 other ways that we can apply a hidden Markov model. In a semi-supervised learning framework, we have some labeled data, or in a supervised learning framework where all the data has a behavioral label associated with it. Of course, this might be the dream, but it's impractical. This is not likely to occur. However, oftentimes researchers might have small portions of the time series where they were able to observe the animal in some capacity. While semi-supervised learning frameworks are not necessarily developed in the study of animal movement, I think there's now going to be a push toward incorporating some labeled data. And in part, if you have some specific behaviors of interest, you can validate whether the HMM is actually capturing specific behaviors, or if there's some states that are capturing multiple behaviors of interest. But the great thing is that momentum can actually accommodate all 3 frameworks. You can easily incorporate labeled data. Oftentimes with a different implementation, the model checking is going to change. So in a fully unsupervised learning framework, we cannot assess if the states reflect meaningful behaviors in any capacity. So keep in mind, a lot of people will emphasize the state decoding results. And this is seen a lot in hidden Markov model papers. But this can only be validated with domain expertise. It's not validated in any statistical way. In a semi-supervised or supervised framework, we can start to assess whether our states do actually capture the behaviors of interest. We can, of course, also assess model fit, although often supervised frameworks with labeled time series data focus on developing models for state prediction. Okay, so in a fully unsupervised framework, we can't assess the predictive capacity of the model in terms of the state decoding results. But once we do have some label data, it can start to move toward state predictions, or validating the state predictions that we obtain. So in summary, hidden Markov models are very useful for marine movement data. They're highly flexible frameworks for data collected over time or in sequence that can accommodate a lot of structures that are useful to learn about marine systems. Their formulation matches the intuition that what we observe is a manifestation of the animal's underlying behavioral state. With care in both the data collection process and the model building framework, HMMs can reveal novel insights into the behavioral dynamics of marine mammals and marine animals in general.